If you asked me what's my favorite game of all time, the answer would not be Resident Evil 0. In fact, Resident Evil 0 would not be even in top 10, and not even in top 50. And it's not to say that it's an inherently bad game, but it is kind of mid. And that is why Resident Evil 0 should get a remake. Kind of. Resident Evil 0 was the first game in a franchise to introduce mechanics where you have two playable characters and you can play as them interchangeably. This allowed for new interesting puzzles to be introduced in the game where you would need two characters to solve them. But in the end, it sort of ended up falling flat on its face. Many times throughout the story, the swapping between characters interrupts the pacing. It's not bad, but a lot of times you're in the middle of doing something with one character and the game sort of forces you to swap to the other. The worst thing about that is characters do not have a shared inventory, which means that let's say you're solving a puzzle as Rebecca and you're missing a key item, which Billy has, who can be in an entirely different room at the moment. You need to switch to Billy, drop the item, and go get it as Rebecca, which can feel very tedious. And speaking of items, Resident Evil 0 did the monumental step for the franchise to abandon the item boxes. And you might be telling to yourself that, well, Resident Evil 4 doesn't have an item box and it's great, so I bet it's the same case for Resident Evil 0. No, it fucking sucks. While it is true you technically have 12 inventory spaces because you have two characters, it's still nearly not enough. So what the game does is it introduces the mechanics of dropping items on the ground and then getting back to them when you need them. Now it is true that each bigger area has a smaller area or a room designated for this purpose where you can drop items and you can easily get back to them. For example, in the mansion, it's the entry hall, which is relatively close to every other room in the mansion, but I do not really think that solves the issue. It feels rather annoying having to go back to the entry hall for a key item where there could have easily been an item box closer by. I mean, I don't get it. They had a mechanic that was working fine. They had the item box. All they had to do was shut up and put the item box in Resident Evil 0 and make as much money as they wanted to. But no, they just had to blow it all up. Anyway, so if Resident Evil 0 Remake does get made, it should definitely have the item box or have the inventory system reworked to the way it looks like in Resident Evil 4 for both characters. Because I'm not gonna carry the hookshot with me again. And speaking of the characters, honestly, make just one character playable or make the game co-op like Resident Evil 5. I know this is kind of a hot take, because the two character swapping gameplay was something that made Resident Evil 0 unique. But I honestly do not think the gameplay justifies having to swap between characters. The gameplay between the two is not all that much different. The only differences are that Barry cannot mix herbs, which is more annoying than anything, can move heavy objects and has a lighter in his inventory. He can also sustain more damage, which is all almost the same differences as Chris and Jill have, except for the moving heavy objects and not being able to mix herbs. While Rebecca can fit into tight spaces, can mix herbs, but is a lot weaker against enemies. Honestly, I think the way to do it is you get to pick one character at the beginning of the game and you play as them for the remainder. And there could be segments in the game where Billy has an advantage and segments where Rebecca has an advantage. For example, let's say they separate at some point in the game, and if you play as Rebecca, there could be a tight space that's accessible to her that wouldn't be accessible to Billy. You get the idea basically. The other way to do it would be to have a chapter be played as Rebecca and then the next chapter be played as Billy. I just don't think the swapping between characters could work in a modern Resident Evil game. Although take a look, for example, at Resident Evil Revelations 2, which is the most underrated game in the franchise. It's actually so good you should probably go and play it right now. You have two sets of characters. You have Claire and Moira and Barry and Natalia, and you can swap between these characters, but each set has the main character you're gonna spend the majority of time playing as, because only one of these characters can really fight. Moira does not use guns and Natalia is 10 years old. Although I do not think that would really work for Resident Evil 0, because the point of that story is that both Rebecca and Billy are basically equally important. So yeah, I do not really like the swapping mechanics in Resident Evil 0. Also, I never had an idea you can do that, but apparently in Resident Evil 0 you can swap between these characters with one button. I never had an idea I could do that when I first played it, because the game never really tells you. I always swapped through the inventory. These are the biggest issues I got with the gameplay side of the game. Now about the story. I mean, for Resident Evil standards, it's not even really all that bad. But it is pretty unremarkable. There's not much you can change, given how Resident Evil 0 is supposed to fit into the narrative of the overall Resident Evil lore. Marcus as a villain, even though it's not really Marcus technically, but it sort of is. It's the leech monster that has Marcus's memories and his consciousness basically, which is such an interesting concept. It's such a boring villain. I think the reason for all that is that throughout the entire game, Marcus is sort of covered as this great mystery, and you're trying to find out who it is. And he is one of the founders of Umbrella, which is pretty important for the overall lore. But you as a player do not really care. I mean, yeah, he is there, but this game is a prequel, so it's not gonna matter in the long run. Marcus just simply is not captivating. He's not as charismatic and goofy as Wesker, and he does not have the same relationship with the protagonist as Sadler. His backstory does not make him redeemable like the Baker family. So by the end of the game, where the reveal happens, you kinda just wanna be done with the game. And I would keep the concept of him being like a leech monster, because those leech monsters, they're pretty interesting. I feel like in the RE engine, with the streak that Capcom has with the remakes, the leeches could become a pretty iconic monster. But what people really want from the remake, and what the remake should focus on, is of course Wesker. Resident Evil 4 sort of introduced Wesker into the remake continuity as a background villain for that game. And that worked very well for that game and also for the remake continuity in general. Capcom now has the opportunity to build upon Wesker in this remake continuity retrospectively through the remakes before going for Resident Evil 5, because I think you sort of have to do that. Having Wesker being introduced in Resident Evil 4 just for him to die in the next remake would just feel, first of all, disrespectful to the character, and second of all, just plain weird. And I mean, of course, everyone knows who Wesker is. He's one of the most iconic gaming villains of all time. So technically speaking, he does not need a reintroduction. But think about it from the storytelling perspective in the remakes. We've met Wesker in the latest game, and we have not met Chris yet in the remake continuity. So while everyone knows what happened between those two, I think to have that backstory told within the games, within the remake continuity, is important before finally moving to Resident Evil 5. The Resident Evil 0 remake, if it gets made, it should definitely have more Wesker and even more Birkin, because like, why not? And then of course Resident Evil 1 remake should be next. The game does have a remake already, but like, I feel it's a bit weird that does not have an RE engine one yet, even though the Resident Evil remake from 2002 is one of the best Resident Evil games out there, like seriously. Rebecca's character should be also built upon. She's not as interesting compared to the other Resident Evil protagonists. Some of the locations could be improved. The train section at the beginning is so good. Like, bring that shit back. That's one of the best openings in horror games ever. Billy as a character was okay for Resident Evil standards, but I think he should also be improved to make him less of a stereotype of the misunderstood hero, and for both characters to make it obvious that what they're going through is obviously traumatic, because most of the time they're pretty unreactive to what's happening to them, which is kind of goofy. The mansion and the laboratory sections are honestly pretty cheap. Most of the assets were used from previous games, and it's just so boring. So in conclusion, Resident Evil 0 is not bad. It had a lot of potential, but it failed up to live up to it. I swear to God, this is the most grass is green take about Resident Evil 0. There are some things to be improved about it that I highlighted in this video. So if any Capcom producer is watching right now and Resident Evil 0 is already in development and you are not following the guide that I presented in this video, just cancel it. Just cancel the development altogether and start again, okay? It's not worth it, man. Just start over. And you can thank me later when Resident Evil 0 Remake sells 1 Residentilion copies. So thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'm not saying that because of myself, I'm saying that because of you. Your life without my channel is fucking nothing. And I'm not trying to be mean or anything, I'm just stating a fact. Right now, you're just surviving, but when you like and subscribe, you're gonna finally start living. So do something for yourself finally, and hit that like button and that subscribe button. And yeah, goodbye.